Welcome to Nevada and to the 2021 Art and Environment season. The Nevada Museum of Art has organized 5 exhibitions to serve as the backdrop for land art, past, present, futures. Gianfranco Gorgoni, Land Art Photographs, features 50 of this Italian photographer's most iconic images of earthworks in the American West. From Michael Heiser and Walter Di Maria to Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson, Gorgoni was on the ground in the late 1960s to help bring these projects to life. For nearly 2 decades, the Nevada Museum of Art has considered what is next for land art. We've collected archives and artworks for our permanent collection that look deeply at iconic earthworks. We've asked, who are the voices that have been left out of this dialogue? And what artists are critiquing the genre's most iconic artworks? We've worked with and commissioned artists who see land as part of a larger system. And we've acknowledged those who have known this and fought for this all along. Judy Chicago began making work in response to land art in the late 1960s. Her dry ice, fireworks, and atmospheres performances offered an alternative, ephemeral engagement with the land. The Nevada Museum of Art recently acquired this archive and is debuting it for the first time. The desert has always attracted mischief makers, those artists and dreamers who see and think differently, who aim to experiment in hopes of changing the world. High Desert Test Sites in Joshua Tree, California has offered artists this creative testing ground for over 2 decades. Rose B. Simpson's monumental earthen figures ascend from the gallery floor in her exhibition, The Four. Commissioned and recently acquired by the Nevada Museum of Art, their overwhelming presence reminds us all that land art and the land itself is more than just the earth beneath our feet. Good morning from Reno, Nevada, and welcome to all of you to the 3rd session in our 2021 Art and Environment season. We're so happy that you could join us today. My name is Ann Wolf, and I'm the Andrea and John C. Dean family Chief Curator and Associate Director here at the Nevada Museum of Art, and I welcome all of you on behalf of all of my colleagues. As we continue with our season of land art, we begin today by acknowledging that the Nevada Museum of Art is located in the Great Basin on the occupied territories of Indigenous people. The state of Nevada consists of 27 federally recognized tribes from 4 nations: the Numu, Northern Paiute, Niue, Western Shoshone, Washeshu, Washoe, and Nuwu, Southern Paiute people. We acknowledge that more can be done to further research and integrate the stories of Indigenous people and cultures into the story of land art and into our collective knowledge of the lands of this place. We're very fortunate to call many of artists and leaders in these communities our partners and our friends, and we welcome all of them who are here with us today. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our next 2 speakers. I think I'll ask both Cauleen Smith and Cameron Shaw to turn on their cameras so that we can see them while I'm sharing some background on them. I'm happy to introduce them. Cauleen Smith, there she is an interdisciplinary artist whose work reflects upon the everyday possibilities of the imagination. Operating in multiple materials and arenas, Smith roots her work firmly within the discourse of mid-20th century experimental film. Drawing from structuralism, third world cinema, and science fiction, she makes things that deploy the tactics of these disciplines while offering a phenomenological experience for spectators and participants. Her films, objects, and installations have been featured in solo exhibitions at Mass MoCA, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Contemporary Art Museum Houston, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where her current exhibition, Give It or Leave It, is on view until October 31st. Cauleen was born in Riverside, California, and grew up in Sacramento. She earned a BA in cinema from San Francisco State University and a Master's of Fine Arts from the University of California, Los Angeles. She also attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and she lives in Los Angeles and is a professor at Cal Arts School of Art. So welcome, Cauleen. And then Cameron Shaw was appointed the executive director of the California African American Museum in February of 2021, after serving as their deputy director and chief curator since September 2019. A native of Los Angeles, Shaw previously co-founded and served as executive director of the New Orleans-based Pelican Bomb, a nonprofit contemporary art organization that functioned from 2011 to 2018. In addition to her institutional practice, she is an award-winning writer and editor whose work has appeared in numerous national outlets, books, and exhibition catalogs. Cameron, it's been a pleasure getting to know you over the past year, and we're not only excited about this talk today, but some other collaborations that we have in the works for next year with you and the museum. So I'm not only just pleased to introduce Cauleen and Cameron, but I also wanted to share that we're especially excited that the Nevada Museum of Art earlier this year acquired Cauleen Smith's film Remote Viewing. I know we're going to hear more about that today, but it's currently on view in our exhibition Land Art Expanding the Atlas. So it's great to have a part of you, Cauleen, here with us all the time in Nevada. And you know, I think I'll pass it to the two of you. We had a great conversation yesterday with Lisa Lefebvre and Kelly Kivland talking about Earthworks for the Present and the legacies of Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt. And I think they posed some great questions during their talk. A couple of them were, how can we challenge and redefine practices of land art? How does a situated understanding of art impact land art? And finally, how does land art's legacy inform contemporary engagement with land, landscape, and place? And I have a feeling that Cauleen and Cameron will do a lot to answer some of these questions in their dialogue. So please go ahead and leave questions in the chat. I'm going to sign off until we return at the end to handle Q&A, but they will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will go ahead and have questions and answers following their conversation. So thanks, Cameron and Cauleen.
Thank you, Anne. Hello to everyone out there on your computers and devices. Hi, Cauleen. I'm so happy to be in dialogue with you today.
Oh, me too. Thank you for doing this with me.
I really want to devote the bulk of our time to conversation. We'll be focusing on Remote Viewing, a film by you, the artist Cauleen Smith, that is currently on view at the Nevada Museum of Art and in the museum's permanent collection. Before we dive into conversation, I'd like to orient us with some stills from that work. So I'll be sharing my screen. I just wanted everyone to have a moment to understand the aesthetics as Cauleen is sharing more about the film today. And I'd also like to orient us with a few images from the land art canon that Cauleen is addressing both directly and indirectly with the film. This is an image of Robert Smithson, Partially Buried Woodshed from 1970, a work in which Smithson piled earth atop an abandoned woodshed on the campus of Kent State in Ohio until the center beam collapsed. This is an image of a work by Christo and Jean-Claude, Valley Curtain, 1970-1972, which consisted of a 400-meter long cloth stretched between Rifle Gap Valley in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And finally, the image of Double Negative, the 1969 work by Michael Heiser, which consists of a trench in the earth made by the displacement of 244,000 tons of rock near Overton, Nevada. So Cauleen, we're going to dig right in, and I'm sorry, not sorry about that earthwork pun. The remote viewing work is in conversation with Robert Smithson's Partially Buried Woodshed from 1970, but it's also a direct response to another historical event that you heard on a StoryCorps podcast. I'd like to begin with you sharing the details of that story.
Sure. I was living in San Diego, and my alarm clock is just set to wake up to the radio. It's StoryCorps usually, and I like half asleep listening to this man named Reverend Seawood describe his 10-year-old memory of an event that happened to him, in which he grew up in a town named Sheridan, Arkansas. His mother was responsible for the schoolhouse in this very segregated town, in which all of the Black citizens of the town worked in the lumber mill and lived in mill housing. And when desegregation occurred, I guess there was some resistance. No, I don't guess. There was some resistance to desegregation. And so the way he tells it, his mother just sort of got this, the way he tells it, the Black families were sort of forced to move out of the town, move out of the mill housing. His mother vowed to sort of stay with the school, the Black schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse, until every citizen had finally left. When that happened, apparently she got a call. She loaded him into their station wagon, drove to the side of the schoolhouse where an excavator was already digging a hole. And they watched. And then he describes that they pushed the schoolhouse into this giant hole and it just disappeared. And I'm still half asleep as I'm hearing the story, and I physically like flinched and moaned when in my mind, I'm like drawing the picture of the schoolhouse, and then I didn't expect it to just be shoved into a hole and erased. And that's the way he described it. He just said it was like we had never existed. And I went to work that day, and I just kept thinking about this, especially in the context of teaching at UC San Diego, in a visual arts department. As a filmmaker, I'm always studying up about art because I didn't study it formally. So I'm studying Smithson and Heiser, Terrell, all of the Nancy Holt, everyone trying to sort of catch up to the discourse that's happening in my student studios. They're obsessed with land art, earthworks, etc. So I'm studying along with them. And in the back of my head, I can't quite understand this other story about Reverend Seawood's schoolhouse. So it just sort of simmered there for a while.
And that's something I want to talk about is how did that story stand in contrast for you from the principles and positionality of the land art tradition that you were self-educating yourself on?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I'm just kind of going to the library and pulling off the books, like the canonical books about land art. And I probably wasn't even reading the most current scholarship. So that scholarship was just focused on sort of like the scale, the grandeur, the sort of like powerful vision of these sort of interventions into the surface of the earth. I checked out, UC San Diego has this 16 millimeter print of Smithson spiral jetty film. So I checked it out, threaded it through the projector and sat there and watched it a couple of times. And I love that film. He's talking about Paleolithic time. He's talking about dinosaurs and this like distant past of like what the earth remembers, things I'm also very interested in. But there was no discussion actually about the land as we live on it and the very fundamental contested nature of this land, particularly this land that we're on, Turtle Island, as it's called by some. And I couldn't quite reconcile this sort of aporia, like this like sort of like non-recognition of this. I mean, I was reading stories about Baldessari going out into the desert and lighting dynamite to see what happened. And I'm just like, I don't know, even in the 70s, people had some awareness of like ecology and the relationship to the earth. And so I just couldn't figure out where that part of the conversation was. I couldn't find it. It disturbed me. And then that disturbance kind of collided with this other story of digging a hole. When I saw Heiser's trenches, the photographs, I've never visited it. When I saw those photographs and I was like trying to reckon with the scale of that, I was like, so to dig, and then there's a lot of discussion about sort of like the Herculean task of making those trenches, right? And I was like, oh, so it's hard to do this. So I couldn't quite understand, like why you would dig a hole to bury a house. In the same way that I couldn't understand like a kind of comfort with digging giant trenches in the desert. Like I found it unsettling and a little bit frightening. People said, no, when you go visit it, it's not like that. It's beautiful. And I still haven't visited. So all I can think of is like giant, spooky, deep trenches in the desert. I'm still there with like, wow, this seems like an animal trap or something, you know?
Yeah, also land as simply material.
Just material.
Mhm.
That, I mean, material in such a way as to and also to like to create markings and stuff in it that are willfully sort of evacuated of a narrative so that they're purely formal. You think of that in contrast to like North American like earthworks, like the mounds that are all over the continent, that were used for various things, burials and other ceremonies as well, and a kind of like deep content and cultural practice that goes into one kind of accumulation of earth, I guess, and then these gestures that are very deliberately supposed to sort of create boundaries between historical content, unless it's like, you know, the land of the dinosaurs and like the now and the real and the politic of, and the people who inhabit this place. There's like this very willful and deliberate distance there.
So walk us through, and I apologize, I set my PowerPoint to start at the beginning, but lo and behold, it started in the middle. So walk us through what happens in the film, what actually happens in the film.
So remote viewing was my attempt to reenact this very puzzling event that Reverend Seawood had shared. I couldn't understand like why you would bury a house underground, and to the point where I decided I had to reenact it. What you see first is just sort of some barren land. You see in the distance some soccer field lights, and you see this very, very enormous green screen erected on scaffolding, which in itself was a kind of structure.
And I want to get back to that green screen at some point later in the conversation.
Yeah, it's just sort of there, and then like often forget to talk about it, but it's really there. So that's the first thing you see, and then you see these giant excavators kind of like crawling around, and they start digging it. It starts digging into the earth, and it starts digging in this really sort of like almost acrobatic way, because the excavator that I hired was really, really, I don't know how, like a dancer with this machine, and he could just spin it around. So there's a lot of watching him maneuver this great machine and move this dirt, a giant pile of earth, the negative space of this beautifully like cut hole that he built, like slowly reveals itself, and two figures appear, a woman and a boy, who are to represent Reverend Seawood and his mother, and they're just functioning as witnesses. They come right up to the edge of this hole as it's being built, and it's at that moment that you can kind of understand the scale of this hole, the depth of it. Once the hole is dug, we return there. Oh, there's also a schoolhouse. Forgive me, I forgot about the schoolhouse, didn't I? There's a schoolhouse in front of the green screen, just sitting there in front of the hole. So at some point, you know, it's just the green screen, the house, and the hole. And the next thing you know, bells start ringing, and the one room schoolhouse appears to be sliding forward, and it slides into the hole. Dirt, smoke clouds everywhere, and then they just, you know, the excavator comes back through and just covers it up, just fills in the hole, pats it down, drives away, and you're just left with the green screen and the land itself, and as if nothing has occurred. And the pacing of this video, it's about 14 minutes long, so at any moment, if you were to walk into a gallery to see this video, you might see something, a very slow pace, like excavator digging a hole. You might see only the green screen and the land. You might see the schoolhouse just sitting there. You might see the mother and the child figures. But it's over time, this kind of cataclysmic event happens like right in the middle of the video, which you could easily miss if you're just visiting a gallery for a short period of time.
We're going to watch that moment together in a little bit. I'd like to dig into the mother and son. There's an element of recreation, but it's in no way a dramatization, in that they have no particular emotion attached to them. We have no particular emotion attached to the figures. Can you speak to the choice to use actors in the way that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I went through a lot of iterations in my mind and research around what it is to reenact. You know, sort of like the literal docudrama reenactment where you have people pretending to be other people. So I started there with my casting. And then I had to keep circling back to Reverend Seawood's story, which didn't belong to me. You know, like it had sort of haunted me and had like really entered my psyche, like physically entered my body, but it was still just his story. And it was more than that, it was his 10-year-old memory of the event. So when I really, really listened to his story, I could recognize all of the sort of 10-year-old blind spots, like who called his mother? Like, what was her job exactly? You know, there are a lot of details that are just not there because he was 10. And so that sort of made me sort of like back off of a kind of literal idea. And all I really wanted then were witnesses to this thing, because in the same way that Reverend Seawood witnessed this event and the erasure, it's still as if we can't see this. Because to me, what is really being signified with this gesture is, to me, this is like a kind of quintessential representation of this country's resistance to the Supreme Court decision to integrate public schools, that it was willful and a deliberate resistance, and that it's not an accident that the world is segregated. It's that way because people wanted it that way, and that this gesture, to me, signified it. So it became so much bigger than Mr. Seawood and the details of his event. And so they function as the witnesses that we don't seem to have to the truth of this country and its origin stories.
I'd like to also talk about the actual production of the film. You shot it while you were an associate professor at UC San Diego.
Assistant professor at
UC San Diego. The conditions of production, to me, are really central to the work. And I'm hoping that you can speak to, as a Black woman who was an assistant professor at the time, how you came to dig a 20-foot deep hole on campus without seeking university permission.
Yeah. You know, like I didn't know. I was really naive because all I knew about land art was what I'd been reading about, you know, the Heisers and the Trails out there in the desert, just like going for it, you know? So I didn't think it would be that big of a deal to dig a 20-foot deep hole, but it is. It's actually almost impossible to do in any urban environment. And even if you have private lands, there could be something underground that you can't like tap into. And so everywhere that I was looking, on private property, on public property, there were giant barriers to digging a hole. Turned out this was 2010, just a couple of years after the giant like Great Depression, the recession. I don't know what they call that, when everybody lost their money temporarily. And the University of California school system had to freeze all of their building projects. So across from my studio at UC San Diego in the visual arts department was the site for their new building, which is probably there. I haven't been back there since this. And it was all fenced off, and across from it, there's the contractor trailers that I walk by every day on the way to my studio, my office. And someone said, you should go talk to that guy because there's some land right there. And it was kind of perfectly sited because of these, the soccer field across the way kind of resonated with Reverend Seawood's story. He shared a memory of like being a kid watching football games at the White High School from a stack of logs that was near their one-room schoolhouse. And they'd be across the street looking at this huge white lighted, perfectly manicured football field from the Black side of this town, sitting on these logs. And so I thought there was a wonderful like echo of this site. I went and talked to the contractor and I said, so who would I talk to about like maybe digging a hole like on this empty property that you're not doing anything with? He's like, oh, you would talk to me, because there's a way in which when a contractor takes on a big building project, they insure the project. So while that insurance is enacted and while that building is happening, the contractor, the holder of that insurance, is the owner of the property. And so he was like, this is mine right now. And I'm waiting for them to give me the go ahead to build. And I've got these guys with the excavators who'd love some work. So if you just pay them their rate, we can do this. Like, when do you want to do it? You want to do it this weekend? Let's go. And I couldn't believe it because I talked to the dean, I talked to the chancellors, I'd like been all over the campus, and people were just like, no, like basically go away. You are of no importance. This is of no importance. We're not interested. And this guy was like, I would love to give my guys some work. And I happen to have the creative capital money. So I was like, they can have all of my money. Let's dig this hole. Let's do it. So that's kind of how it came about. And what I didn't realize was that when you circumvent things, that's fine. But when you do it on a huge scale where you then erect 30 feet cube of green screen fabric that kind of like catches all the light and starts to glow from across campus, it produces, you know, some, I don't know, what, antagonisms, maybe, where it seemed that maybe I had overstepped my boundaries as an assistant professor and my relationship to the property of the University of California. But it didn't matter. And the contractor did not care. He was like, this is mine right now. I got guys out of work. They won't let me build. Let's go.
And to me, that question of what is a transgression, who has permission, to whom do we ask permission, all of that so much became a part of this story, especially the story of navigating segregation and the lengths that many in this country went to ensure its legacy.
Right. Enforcement,
I mean, even
right.
today. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm sorry, I could go on, but I see you have another question. Keep going.
Oh, I'm full of questions, but you are going to continue to go on this one. So can you talk a little bit about building the schoolhouse, which was a similarly intense undertaking?
Right. So I found this wonderful art director down in San Diego, a good carpenter, and he didn't know anything about one-room schoolhouses. And I said, not just one-room schoolhouses, but Black one-room schoolhouses, the kind in the South during segregation. He did deep research, came back to me. He's like, I didn't know about this whole, even the way of building. And he built on site the day, like the day before we were to dig the hole. The contractor let him on site with a bunch of lumber so that he could build the structure, lovingly build the structure with a bunch of volunteers, a one-room schoolhouse that they painted and then even put plantings around it to make it look like it had always been on the site in front of this green screen. It was like a real, everything down to the details of a bell. Like he said, a lot of schoolhouses had bells because sometimes there were also churches. He really, really made these wonderful decisions about this little structure, even the scale of it. He's like, well, it would have been impossible for it to be less than 16 feet by 16 feet. So I think that's the scale we have to build. Because I was like, can you just make a tiny, tiny version? He's like, I really can't. It's got either we're gonna build the schoolhouse or we're not. And I said, okay, build the schoolhouse. So he actually built like a fairly functional structure based on his research,
So I want to talk about this green screen before we come back to what the fate of the schoolhouse. So there's a 30 by 30 foot scaffolding covered in green screen fabric. That's the backdrop for the schoolhouse. Yeah. It's very Christo and Jean-Claude, which is why I showed that image earlier, a sort of a piece of land art that you made within a film in dialogue with another piece of land art. It's very meta. The green screen covered scaffolding is fundamentally beautiful aesthetically. And in my mind, I imagined it was maybe hiding another potential distracting background on campus, but also the very fact that it's that particular material also gave me this sense of anticipation when watching the film. Like it's a color that is recognizable to us in this age. And so I kept thinking in the film, it would come to some other practical use, which it never did. So I'm hoping that you can speak to the choice of that structure, the choice of material, and maybe even that sense of anticipation that you're playing with around expectation.
Right. Well, you're correct that the site wasn't perfect because it was a construction site, because it was the year 2010 on a UC San Diego campus. So there was a lot of information that would have really distracted from the reenactment that I was trying to do. And I immediately thought, oh, green screen is like this wonderful like suggestion of alterity, right? it's almost like in my trade, green screens are literally portals through which you can put anything, anywhere, anytime. And so to me, it was just like a no-brainer that like I could just erect a big green screen and just shoot just within that. And I could put anything back there. I could fly out Sheridan and shoot like the lumber mill, which no longer exists, or anything I wanted. So I was kind of like thinking of it tactically like that. But then once it was erected, this is me being more of a filmmaker than an artist, or like maybe an outsider artist or something. That was the first sculpture I'd ever made. I felt like I had this sense of recognition. It's like, oh, this is a thing. This is a pretty glorious thing. And then just watching it, like I spent a day filming it. Like I got up at 5 a.m. and watched the sun rise and shoot through it, make it glow, make it change, like shadows, everything. And I kind of fell in love with it in and of itself. I wish I had been thinking of Christo then. It's only in retrospect that I really recognized all of these sort of connections, which were obviously simmering in my mind because I really was just like pouring through anything I could get my hands on about land art at that time to understand it. So then it became just, I thought it's acceptable just to have it there as a suggestion that there is someplace else. And also I felt like it also interrupted and severed any expectation that this would be a literal like reenactment, that you were supposed to sort of identify with the characters and have some kind of effective drama narrative experience. That the green screen was about a kind of artificiality and about of like proposed site that is also a non-site, right?
I also love thinking about it as a portal to another time and place, perhaps Sheridan when this occurred, the portal that is memory, but also a portal to a past, present, or future, because the history that this reenactment, that the story is a part of, is not behind us, right? It's still very much with us. And I had not thought about the green screen as a portal. So I love that as an idea.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about this piece of it as your first sculpture. I was spending time in your exhibition at LACMA this weekend, and thinking about the relationship between a sculpture practice and filmmaking. In many of the films in that show, there is an architecture as sculpture, not necessarily of your building, but of others that you're visiting. But there is sculpture that you've created, even thinking about the Ikebana videos as sculpture, but also in the innovative way you use sculpture in a work like Epistrophe that's there on view. Can you talk about some of the things you're thinking about in the relation between sculpture and filmmaking? It feels so rich in what you're doing.
Oh, interesting. Like it's funny. I said the word sculpture and I shouldn't have, because I think I'm attracted to things and objects, which I think definitely comes out of filmmaking because of the necessity for locations and props. So I'm very interested in places and sites. I'm very interested in objects and things. And less interested in like sculptures or like proposal for ideas. Because I think like any random object already has like so much to work with. You can put one thing next to another thing to produce another idea altogether, right? So that's a lot of what I do in that work. So and also like the best part of erecting that green screen and the scaffolding was also taking it down. like the fact that it was like a haunting, like an insurgency, that it like arrived and it imposed itself and then it just vanished. And it literally vanished to the point where there were like campus security who drove by and they were like, where's that thing? We're here to check on that thing. And that thing was already gone, So this idea of the fugitivity of the temporary thing, or the mundaneness and banality of like regular objects, I'm really intrigued with like how useful that can be.
That's so interesting to think about what you did in San Diego as a type of intervention with no explanation, right? That is a type of insurgency, that is an intervention. And it's funny because when I was walking in and out of the exhibition, I overheard two people talking about epistrophe, and I think the complex relationship between object and film that you're working with there. And one said lovingly to another, contemporary art is supposed to make you think. So now I'm also thinking about, like you said, the security guards, all those other folks who are walking around the San Diego campus thinking about what they had seen or not seen in what you had done.
Oh, wow.
And that being a real call to action. So I want to talk about the moment the schoolhouse is pushed into the hole that is dug. That moment is shocking and painful to the viewer. But as you described it to me, it was also an extremely difficult moment for the folks who worked with you on remote viewing. So before we get into that, Christian, can you cue that moment in the video so our audience with us today has a moment to sit with this? It takes my breath away every time, and like can put me on the verge of tears, quite honestly. And the ways in which, you know, the moment afterwards, the machine goes back to pile the dirt on top. It's like a funeral. It's like a funeral. So can you talk about that moment and what you learned from it, also witnessing alongside the other folks that were witnessing it who had not imagined it in the same way that you had, or didn't have the space to do so?
Right. So I'll go back to my production designer who did all the research and very lovingly built that structure that you just saw casually kind of like tossed into that hole. And, you know, we only have one shot at this. We only have one schoolhouse. We only have one day to shoot. So we have one go at putting this in the hole. And I'm kind of like procrastinating all day, shooting other stuff because I'm just dreading this moment of having to destroy the schoolhouse. It finally happened. We're all there on the set. We're filming. I cue the excavator, Roberto, and he knocks that house into the hole. And I turn to my production designer and he just looks at me and he just says, I'm gonna need a minute. And then he just like walked off the site and I didn't see him for another hour. And he came back and he's like, you know, I didn't expect for that to hurt me the way it did. He's like, especially now, he said, now that I know all of what I know about these schoolhouses and their history, he's like, I didn't expect it to like, to feel the way I felt when we destroyed it, even though we all knew that's what we were working towards. And it was not just him, it was everybody on the set was just like, what did we just do? And for me personally, that feeling of what did I just do, it really extended into sort of like all aspects of my practice now, Cameron, because I was really interested in reenactments as like a form and as a device in film in particular. I thought it was like a really interesting way to sort of play with memory and history and time. But what I realized is that we only reenact like trauma and terrible, terrible things. We don't, you know, reenact like our like best ever like birthday when we were 9 years old. We don't reenact like that awesome prom date we had. We reenact the traumas on each other and on ourselves over and over and over again. And that I had done that, and I had done it not just to myself, but to even Reverend Seahood and to everyone involved in that shoot. I remember the contractor who like opened the gates for this to all happen. I didn't really tell him what this was about. So after he witnessed that, he's like, what is this about? Like, can you just tell me what you're doing? And so then I finally said, yeah, okay. And so I told him the story about segregation, everything. And I don't know this man's politics, but I wouldn't be surprised if we greatly diverged in how we understand the world. And he just like listened and he nodded. He's like, wow, okay. Well, let me know if you need anything. And he went back to his office, and I felt like I had somehow assaulted everyone. Maybe it's the only way to talk about this particular assault on the culture of our nation. I don't know, but it made me, I'll never do this kind of reenactment again. I will only reenact like the awesome 9-year-old birthday party or the great prom date or whatever.
The best ice cream cone.
Yeah, the best ice cream cone. Like I couldn't believe like how wounded or bruised my crew was after that, and myself too.
It's so powerful, and I think that it's transmitted, right? It's transmitted to everybody who witnesses that moment. Even just seeing the folks in the comments of just like what an incredibly powerful moment that is, and it's made all the more powerful by the sound. So I want to talk a little bit about sound in the film. We didn't see the beginning of the film, but it starts with the hard flapping of birds' wings. And then the sound is just the ambient sounds of the shoot. And first it's the birds, and then they're soon joined by the sound of the large machine digging. And then after that, I actually as I was watching and rewatching, I struggled to even understand the source of the sound.
Right.
There was a question of whether it was ambient, whether it was added in post, whether it was wind, whether it was even some type of deep earth music, So I want to talk about sound in general, but I also want to talk about that moment that we just watched and the sound of bells. And, you mentioned the production designer you worked with and the school bells, but I want to talk about why bells at that moment and just in general, the relationship to sound with the film.
Well, that actually was unplanned. That had everything to do with responding to the design of the schoolhouse and recognize the bell on the structure is fake. It's not operational. So I'm editing the footage and I'm seeing that bell. That's the first thing that starts to move when the excavator starts to push on the structure. The bell moves before the structure moves. And in the raw footage, that was giving me chills. It was like, oh, this is the moment. And then I really latched onto that idea that the idea of alarm, and also, a lot of people talk about like the idea of the sacred with the bells with the church, but for me, it was very much about alarm, about warning, about caution, about danger, because that action is just so violent, right? They're just pushing a structure into a hole, but the scale of the violence, like what is important to understand, and I think everybody interested in land art knows this, but like I did not know how hard it is to dig a hole that's 20 feet deep and 20 feet, like 20 feet cubic. I did not understand it. Not only is it difficult, it's dangerous. So my excavator had to have help, and he had to explain, like, if we see any kind of ground moving, we're backing off. You know what I mean? Like, we dug the hole one night, and then the next day we came back to shoot the house going into the trench, and I had nightmares the whole night about finding a child or an animal in that hole. It was so deep that if you went into it, you would not get out because it was so beautifully sheared. Like the earth was so beautifully sheared, like to the point of polishing the dirt. There's no way you could get out. So the bells to me were just really about a kind of psychic warning. And thank you for everything you're saying about the sound, because I really wanted to create like a sonic envelope that you wouldn't feel, that you wouldn't know you were in. And I wanted certain things to just sort of like hit you. So every once in a while, the excavator like presses down on the earth and you'll hear these deep rumbles.
Yes, that's the earth music I was talking about.
Yeah, so that's ironically, and maybe another nod to Smithson, those sounds are from Hollywood sound effects for dinosaur footsteps. So like so like I couldn't find another kind of like sound that sounded like the pressing of the earth in any sound effects, except for like Jurassic Park sound packets, you know? So, and then even when I was editing that, I was thinking about Smithson Spiral Jetty and his like obsession with dinosaurs. So
yeah, you know, it's like that bell, it's a preparation for the moment. And, you know, I thought about church bells, the sacred, I thought about school bells, but there was also something like a dinner bell, like the school being swallowed by the earth, and the earth having a voracious appetite. You know, a proto siren, something that is the alarm, the warning. And then I also kind of came back to the alarm bell of the story of you waking up to the core story as told by the Reverend, that it was also a wake up call for you. In the work.
That's so interesting. Like, I feel like that this film is like a huge marker in terms of my own personal development as an artist in that regard. One, in terms of learning about how art can do harm, you know, and I think this final film isn't quite as violent as it was to be there when we actually destroyed the house, but I realized I didn't want to do that to people anymore, that wasn't the contribution that I wanted to make. And another kind of awareness or awakening in terms of like what it means to use someone's story at all. So someone in the chat is asking if Reverend C. Wood was informed, and he was. And I reached out to StoryCorps, and they said, you know, the story itself you can use or refer to, but you know, you can't use our recording, you can't use Reverend C. Wood's voice. And again, that was another cue, a kind of recognition of like, whose story was this? You know, how much am I allowed to speculate or elaborate? Like, it's not mine, but what is it teaching me? Also, for me, the sort of like weird final understanding of desegregation in this country, that it was actively resisted. This is not discussed. It wasn't like we see those pictures of like the kids like screaming at the one little girl or the high school kid going to school. You understand, this was all over the country in every kind of iteration of violence you can imagine, from physical lynchings to the destruction of property to like the willful removal of people from their livelihood and their homes, to the point of self-destruction. So like the town Sheridan, Arkansas it destroyed itself in this resistance and in its quest for like maintaining white supremacy. In the same way, like Gary, Indiana, the same prosperous Black working class, they would rather destroy that than allow that. Like this is like not this is not sort of like a footnote or a marginalia of American culture. This is at the core of late 20th century America, period. That white folks willfully decided that they did not want to live with Black people, and they would do anything to prevent it, even if it meant destroying themselves, which they have over and over again in all these sad little towns all over the Midwest.
I feel like we could talk about this so much, and there's so many other things about the film that I also want to talk about, but we're nearing our time, so I want to continue to go down this road of the relationship between Blackness and land. And you're doing this film, and the relationship between Blackness and land, particularly in this country. And I know that you're working through some ideas specifically on that topic now. I wondered if you might be interested in sharing some of that thinking, or even how your current thinking has evolved your understanding of what you were creating with the work, like remote viewing, or maybe even where it's taking you aesthetically at the moment.
Yeah, okay, such a complicated question, because Blackness and land, like I think in North America for African Americans, it's really difficult at this point in particular to sort of reckon with sort of like placehood and land without also reckoning with indigeneity and genocide, and the way in which slavery and forced captive labor and genocide were really fused in the making of this country. If I'd been thinking about those things a little bit more when I made this, the video might have had another kind of witness as well. At the time that I was shooting this, there was a huge movement on campus to return the president's house that is owned by UC San Diego is built on Native American burial grounds. The house is sitting on top of burial grounds, and they know this, and they don't care. Like, I think maybe one president moved out of the house out of respect, but that was going on while I was filming this, and I wasn't able to like fuse those, or maybe even was very hesitant to attempt to, because these are really different issues. But it's something I think about a lot now. So in terms of Blackness, and the land, like now I'm thinking about, like, I actually am embracing Smithson's attraction to thinking about long and slow time. There's this Native American joke where like a white settler in Montana says, you know, my family's been on these mountains for 4 generations. And then a Native American gentleman says, we have gossip that's 4 generations old. So like the idea of like time and scale and relation has become really interesting. Also, inseparable from that in North America is violence. And so I've been obsessed with things like volcanoes and gemstones and like the things that the earth produces out of like time and violence and accumulation of a lot of different other materials. So that's vague. I'm keeping it vague kind of deliberately. But yeah, my interest in the land and relating to it has continued. It's just really changed. My references have changed.
Thank you so much, Cauleen. I see that we have a couple questions. I'm going to take these questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Anne, did you want to take the questions?
Yeah, I don't mind going ahead, jumping in to keep it easier for you. We have one that has come in from Miwan Kwan. She's curious to know if the Stewart collection of large-scale site-specific sculpture that's at UC San Diego in any way had an impact on your project. And I think she's specifically referring to the house on top of the engineering building. I think it's by Doho Su, but it might have been after the creation of your work.
Yeah, that wasn't there when I was making this work. But I was aware that Mary Beebe was working on that. I thought it was I love the idea, but I had already shot this when that was in progress. No, I would say that the sculpture collection, as wonderful as it is a really different project. You know what I mean? It actually it considers site, but it doesn't consider land and its historical proposals or problems. So I was really interested in what a beautiful collection it was. But she told me a story that really, like, it was illuminating in many ways, where she said, Mary Beebe said something about like really wanting to have Martin Puryear build a wooden bridge over one of those canyons. And I thought, oh, what I wouldn't give to see that. And she said, well, you know, it's all about money. It's all about donors. Can't get the money. And it's like art world at its best right there. So that was like as far as I went with that in terms of like what kind of support certain kinds of discourses have.
Let's see, Emily Eliza Scott has a question, actually a question that I also had. I'm sure you're probably familiar with Renee Green's work, also about Smithson's project at Kent State. It was a suite of works that she did 1996, 97, 98 called Partially Buried. And I think both Emily and I are interested to know whether she was a reference point for you at all in the making of this work and kind of reconsidering the legacy of Smithson.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I feel like we came at it in really different directions, and I was very aware of her work. And Renee Green is like a really, really profound and important influence. But I actually stumbled on to her Smithson work a little bit late in the process. I was already editing. And one thing I really regretted not knowing about was her use of her hands in touching the archival material. I thought that was a gesture that I really could have done something with, that I just didn't know about at the time. You know, like I said, I'm studying as I go often. as an artist.
I think it's interesting to think about, how Kent State, the slippery memory of those events there as well, right? The Smithson structure remained for many, many years. I think it was until 1984 with the spray paint of the date of the protest on it. It kind of became a memorial of sorts. And then it anonymously was taken off of campus. It disappeared. It was erased as well, right? Its history was erased. I think it took 20 years for historical markers to be placed in honor of the 4 who died there. And I think it was only in 2021 that there were markers placed for those that were wounded. And so I think there's this interesting layering that takes place that both Renee and you call forth in your work.
Yeah, I mean, what's important about Smithson's time on Kent State in that residence is he did a lot of gestures, most of which were very ephemeral. And there's I'm sure you guys know all about the documentation of those, but I was really interested in that. I even made another film about one of his grid works, trying to reenact that. And so I was actually really interested in that, his time on that campus, and also being very aware of what it would mean to do those gestures on a college campus. And maybe the 70s was a little looser, but Smithson would have been navigating some really interesting problems to pull off some of those things that he did.
See, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'll combine 2 here. Someone's asking, where did you get the funding for your work? But also, what happened to the site and the excavation after making the film? Is the house still buried? Is the schoolhouse still buried there? Do you still see the site as part of the work, or does it only exist in the film?
The site is completely underneath a building now, which was why I was able to shoot it in the first place, is that it was a construction site. And there's a building there that I haven't even seen because I left to UC San Diego, I think a year after I shot this film. In terms of what happened to the house, what you don't see in the film is once the house goes in the hole, the excavators pulled the house out of the hole, and then they refilled the hole just with dirt. They didn't leave that material in the ground, because even that ground had been surveyed for construction for I don't know what's underneath the building, so they had to leave it ready for that.
See one more question, great question that's come in from Aaron O's. Does being a woman change your outlook on earthworks? Your film relies on the removal of earth as being seen as a destructive act. How do you connect the feminine with creation and the masculine with destruction in your work and the historical frame?
I never thought of that. That's really interesting. I think it's just really easy, and I have to be careful about it, because I mean no disrespect, but it's very easy to look at some of these grand gestures, these earthworks, as phallic enactments of boys with big toys out in the desert. And it's an easy crack to make because it is definitely a part of the practice, a kind of machismo. And this entitlement to kind of extract something from the earth. I think these are all part of patriarchy, which is all part of a kind of colonial system that we're all living in. So I think this is not so much about a dialectic between masculine and feminism, so much as a real way of considering relations with the earth and the systems that inform the way that we relate to the earth.
Cauleen, I literally could not think of a better note to end on than that sentence. So just thank you, Anne, so much for having us. And Cauleen, thank you for your thoughtfulness and being in dialogue today. It was truly a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Both of you, and we're so proud to be stewards of your film here at the Nevada Museum of Art. So thank you.
It's a true honor, Anne. Thank you so much, everyone.
And I think Christian might hop on with a little bit of housekeeping before we close. So thank you all today.
Bye, Cameron.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, so much. And thank you, Cameron and Cauleen. That was just such a whirlwind of a last hour. I wish we could stay on for much longer. I'd like to invite everybody back to our next session, New Monuments for a Future Generation, with Justin Favela and Emmanuel Ortega next week, Friday, October 8th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Same place. See you in a week. Thank you, everybody.